Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Breaking Bad Season 3. This video is a part of a series of videos where I cover every episode of Breaking Bad, one season at a time. In this video I will cover all of the episodes in Season 3 of Breaking Bad. Season 3, Breaking Bad. Now, as I mentioned in previous videos, I think Breaking Bad gets better every season. At the start of Season 3, found myself doubting that assertion, saying, is this really better than Season 2? But then, of course, by the time we get to the end of the season, I think, well, that's an astounding yes, is definitely better than Season 2. There were times throughout the season, though, that I found myself second-guessing that maybe Season 3 was not as good as the previous seasons, and it was a real drop in quality. But then, of course, there's other times where I thought, wow, this is way better than the previous season. This is a huge increase, which ultimately I think I'd go with the latter on that. So one thing I will say about Season 3 is I do think it's a different in tone. Like, I think I noticed this more maybe in the, the back of my mind when I first watched this season. Of course, this time, I'm paying a lot more attention, trying to analyze it for this review, so it was much more apparent to me that I feel like this has a more sort of somber tone and a somber pace than the previous two seasons. But I think this is something I always noticed. I just never really articulated it in my mind as much as when I'm sort of forced to try to analyze this and review it. Now, I will say it's funny because I've done a lot of research and reviews of a certain episode, controversial episode, which I will get to eventually this season. But during that research, I found a lot of people saying that Season 3 moved at a fast pace. This is a fast-paced, action-packed season, and I actually very strongly disagree with that. In fact, if I may be so bold, I actually think this is the slowest paced season thus far. Now, action-packed, sure. I mean, there were some really suspenseful action moments in Season 3, but if you look at the overall plot and how things progress and how things happen, actually it moved very slow, and it actually reminded me a lot of Better Call Saul, at least in terms of pacing and tone. Definitely more so than the first two seasons, in terms of it being sort of artsy and having a lot of like cool shots that are meant to be metaphorical, and the pacing being very slow and character based and sort of taking its time to develop its characters. Like that aspect of Better Call Saul, it felt like that was present here in Season 3 of Breaking Bad, way more so than the previous two seasons. So I'm not so sure. Yeah, I totally disagree with this moving at a fast pace kind. And in fact, I've heard others complain about the pace of Season 3, which I will say the first half is definitely not as good as the second half. I think it does get a lot better towards the end, although the middle it gets strong and then it dips again and then it gets better. So maybe it's not accurate to say the second half is better than the first half. It's more of, as a slow start, it builds up in the middle and then it gets slow again, but then builds up towards the end to an absolutely kick-ass, amazing, knock you off your socks ending to the season. So that's why I believe that this is the first season where I really started to think of Breaking Bad as an excellent show, as one of the best TV shows I've ever seen. I definitely was not thinking that. As much as I enjoyed the first two seasons, particularly Season 2, which there are moments I really, really enjoyed, as I covered in the previous video, but I never really thought of it as like top-notch, top-tier, best of the best kind of classic, oh, this is a hit, this will go down as one of the best TV shows of all time, until this season. And again, that wasn't even cemented for me until really season 5, which I think cemented this, in my mind anyway, the place of this show in television history as one of the best shows ever made. Season 4 definitely strengthened it, but season 3 is when I first took notice of that, because I mean, season 1, as I said, I was still comparing it to like shows like Weeds, and season 2 I thought, oh, okay, this is better than Weeds, but it was still, I still wasn't thinking of it as top tier, and I thought a lot of people were overrating it a bit, but this is the season that changed my mind. So yeah, I'm kind of. I mean, ultimately, I do really like the season, but I think it has its downsides, as I said, sometimes I'm sort of back and forth, and certain things I think maybe it could have handled better. The pacing could have been better in certain places. But ultimately, like the 1-2 punch of the final 2 episodes, which I will get to, was really something extraordinary. So, let's go ahead and jump into the episodes of season 3, and let's start with the first episode, No Mas. I really didn't care for this episode. I think this is kind of what had season 3 have a sort of bad taste in my mouth. This is mainly just a setup episode, and sometimes setup episodes can be fine and necessary, but this one I found particularly boring and a struggle to get through. And most of the reason for that is because it dealt with the aftermath of the plane crash at the end of season 2. Now, I covered in my season 2 review how I thought that was really stupid, and like the way they built up to it was a huge like sort of fake out, and it was like, he had to lead. Walter White let Jane die, which led to the airplane guy crashing an airplane, which led to airplane parts falling on Walt's house. It's like it's hard. It's a stretch. It's a lot of leaps and logics, and to try to say that it sort of goes back thematically to Walter White and shows how evil he's becoming, or how guilty he is, or whatever, I think was very poorly handled. I was not a fan of it. So, and this episode dealt a lot with the aftermath of that. So every time, a lot of the scenes that they had where they mentioned the crash and falling up on it, I just groaned. I was like, "Ugh, that's so dumb." I'm sorry, I can't get over how dumb that is. Now, in my season 2 review, I talked about how Q, the air traffic control person, how just because he was a bit distraught couldn't cause a plane to crash. I would imagine it would be a lot harder for an air traffic control person to crash 2 planes together. And in this episode, they try to come up with excuses for that and be like, oh, actually, the plane, they say that because they even mention that when they're having like these news reports going over it, and sure, they're probably trying to address concerns, complaints that people had brought up. And so in this episode, they had the newscaster say something like, oh, there was already something wrong with the plane. It was predisposed. It wasn't carrying. There was some other bullshit that would add to why it crashed. But first of all, that's just obvious, like, pandering excuses, contrived writing, trying to make excuses for bad writing. And secondly, that just adds more layers to all the shit that had to happen for this to happen, and how all the links in the chain, which is very sort of sketchy, that's supposed to lead back to Walt being guilty. So it just frustrates me. And I always remember this episode for that scene where they have that at the school, and they're all trying to console each other about the crash, and Walt like makes this speech, and he's like, oh, actually and he talks about even worse crashes, which just makes people feel worse. Like, I didn't like that scene, and that's what I always think of when I think of this episode, because the scene was boring and silly and unnecessary. But this episode wasn't all terrible. I did like how they dealt with Walt's divorce with Skylar and how that was affecting him emotionally, and got into Jesse being in rehab and how he's starting to recover from all that. So this episode was, not very good. I didn't really care for it. So then we'll get into the next episode, which is Caballa Sin Nombre, which I tried my hardest to pronounce that correctly. But anyway, I did like this episode better. I did appreciate this episode a bit more, even though it was still sort of a setup episode. But it almost seemed like that first one you could have skipped and went straight to this one, or at least condensed them both into one episode. But I want to talk about, since I didn't talk about this in the first episode, I want to talk about now Tuco's cousins. Because this is one thing, and this is one thing I noted when my sister first watched Breaking Bad, because I recommended the show to her. She binge watched it after it had finished its run on TV. Because I kept recommending it. Oh, you gotta watch it. And when she first watched season 3, she's like, I don't like this because what they do with these cousins is ridiculous. They play them like they're the Terminator, and there's just a lot of build up to nothing. Or maybe she didn't say that. Maybe that's me that said that. But I think she definitely mentioned the Terminator thing. And I do feel that the amount of setup to pay off with these characters is disproportionate. That there's way too much setup and not enough payoff. Now, I'll get to the payoff later because the payoff was great. Don't get me wrong. I just don't feel like it required this much setup. And I think they were going a bit overboard with showing how badass these two people are. And I do believe like a lot of these scenes, which usually it would like start the episode and end the episode with these two and have them badass. They show them crawling on the ground in the first episode, which that scene seemed very pretentious to me. I'm sorry, where they're in Mexico and everyone's crawling on the ground. Like, yeah, that seemed like a very pretentious thing. But anyway, and then a lot of these other scenes where they just go around killing people or like showing off how badass they are, they seem entirely unnecessary. Like, you could like cut them from the show and not lose anything. And I think my sister was right that they were trying to sort of portraying them as like the Terminator, like the way they were all silent and they walk very slowly and dun 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 dun. Like, I mean, yes, portray them as badasses. Yes, it does add to the tension that these badasses are coming for Walt, but I think they overplayed their hand, particularly in these first set of episodes. But that's just my opinion. But anyway, as far as this episode in particular goes, I think I like the character stuff in this episode better. I think it deals with Walt having a really hard time over Skylar leaving him and how he tries really hard to win her back, and it's just failing. Like, he just doesn't get it. He doesn't get that, and I believe, if I remember correctly, this is the episode where he admits to cooking meth to her, because she knows, she kind of narrows it down to drugs, but thinks he's a drug dealer, so he has to clarify. And he just doesn't seem to get like just how alienating that is for her, how that is like just a no deal. And I guess I'll get back to my complaints about everyone complaining about Skylar and thinking she's a horrible person. In fact, I got more comments who disagreed with me when I tried to stick up for her. And I'm going to stick up for her again. Now, she's not perfect. She has her flaws, and I wouldn't want to be married to her. I'll just put it in that term. She does have an issue with being controlling and nagging. But Walter is ultimately in the wrong here, way more than she is. I mean, I think, and other people pointed this out in other videos, like Honest Trailers and stuff, that is a bit ridiculous to demonize Skylar when her husband is a megalomaniac, uh, totally driven by his pride to the point of becoming an outlaw and putting all their entire family and all their lives in danger. So, yeah, I still gotta stick by her, but I guess in some of these moments, specific moments in the episode, I can't help but feel sympathy for Walt and feel sorry for him, and I do like subconsciously find myself sort of rooting for him to win her back, which really, if you think about it, I guess on the gut level, and maybe most people who hate her just go by that gut level, you can see that it's that he loves her and she's throwing nothing but venom back. But if you look at it intellectually, she has a very good reason for doing that. Let's be honest here, and I think the show makes it clear in later seasons that Walt is actually the toxic one, not Skylar. She's not without her faults. But anyway, this episode I gotta mention specifically is the roof pizza episode, which I thought it became really iconic. It was an iconic thing of having the pizza on the roof. He gets frustrated, he throws it on the roof, and Skylar calls him the next day, "Do you know anything about this pizza on my roof?" like that. But it sort of it really illustrates just how frustrated he is and how much of a hard time he's having. Now, it's interesting because this did become iconic to the point where I remember listening to Better Call Saul podcasts when they were filming Better Call Saul. They were talking about, they were seriously, agitated, the showrunners, about the fact that tourists would come to Albuquerque to the house where they filmed the exterior, at least, of Walter White's house and throw pizzas on the roof, which people actually lived at that house. And it was amazing how many people were doing this, and they had to the point where Jonathan Banks had to threaten to break the legs or kick the ass of anyone who thought it was cool to go and throw pizza on top of the house where people actually live just because they filmed a TV show. But it is interesting that, and I agree, that's a really stupid thing to do. But it is interesting that that scene was so iconic that it stuck in people's minds so much that they felt the desire to do that. And yeah, so as I said, this was I enjoyed this episode more anyway. It's the roof pizza episode. Anyway, let's get into the next episode. Or before I move on, I believe this was the episode where the cousins show up and are waiting for Walt to kill him, but then Mike is outside. He calls Gus, who calls them off somehow by just saying Poyos, and Gus uses his authority to stop them from doing it. Now this is I think we might have seen Mike in the first episode, but this is when we're starting to see a bit more of him, and they already established him from the get-go really as being Gus's man. This is something I misremembered, so I thought they played him as Saul's PI for a while before they actually introduced the new element of actually he's working for Gus the whole time. But in actual fact, they only did that one episode, the finale of season 2, which was his first appearance, because pretty much right away they show Mike as actually working for Gus, and and Saul's not really aware of that. And I think the way Better Call Saul is setting up for this is absolutely perfect. But yeah, so that was interesting. Of course, it's all interesting when Walt's singing in the shower, and while these two people badass Terminators are waiting outside to kill him. It was a pretty tense scene, but ultimately led to nothing. So let's get into the next episode, which is IFT. And I never really paid much attention to the episode titles, particularly when I first watched the show. And I did watch it on DVD, so I did have the title in front of me, but I didn't really pay much attention to it. Just wanted to watch the episode. So it wasn't until a year or so later where I listened to the commentary track for this episode on that DVD, and they mentioned what IFT stood for, which I mean, it's kind of obvious if you think about it, but I never thought about it because I didn't really even consider the title. I didn't really care. But of course, it stands for I Fucked Ted, which is what Skylar says to Walt at the end of the episode, which was kind of hard hitting the way she did it. And I think, again, I feel some sympathy for her that this is our only way of getting back at Walt. But again, I kind of was subconsciously rooting for him in this episode. The way that he forced himself into the house and refused to leave. And when Skylar called the police, they're like, look, you're not technically divorced. You don't have a restraining order against him. He didn't harm you. He still owns this house, technically, partly. So there's nothing we can do. And so he, by technicality, was forcing himself to live back in there. And that's, in retrospect, it's not the best way to try to win back one's ex, and only serves to frustrate the situation more. But it's really in character with him. It shows the kind of stubborn and arrogant character that he is. And it did become more like a power play between Skylar and Walt. And I also believe this is when Walt called Skylar's bluff. I think Saul mentioned in the previous episode that she wasn't actually going to go to the police, even though she threatened to, because then that would hurt her and her family, and they would lose their house and all this stuff. So it was an empty threat, and he called her bluff. And like, she, actually did call the police, but did not, of course, tell them about the whole cooking meth thing, which she could have. And it was obvious the show was setting this off specifically, where the officer is like, if you know of anything, any reason, anything illegal he's doing, that give me a reason to kick him out. And they were sort of like shouting at her, tell him about the meth, but she still wouldn't do it, which I thought was really interesting. And then, of course, Walt Jr. Is completely ignorant to what Skylar knows. So from his perspective, Skylar's just being completely unreasonable, and this is completely coming out of the blue, and that she's really mistreating his father. So he takes his side, which only, of course, goes to anger her even more. But again, she doesn't want to tell Walt Jr. And also Hank and Marie stick up for Walt because they also don't understand what's going on, and she definitely doesn't want to tell them about what's going on, because that would bring all the consequences down on them. And then we do get this is when Gus actually meets with Tuco's cousins and Hector Salamanca. This, again, they're bringing back Hector Salamanca, and I think they're a sort of, this season in particular is what's establishing more has this sort of iconic character, or at least having a place in the cartel. Now, as I mentioned in my season 2 review, even when they first introduced him, I think the thought behind it was that he was an old cartel soldier, but I think that was just a vague notion. I think they've really built off that in this season and started to build them up to the more of the iconic character and the important character, because I do believe he was kind of meant as kind of a one-off in season 2, but they really brought him back and was establishing more and establishing sort of the history between him and Gus. Though it won't come until season 4 though. And I kind of get the sense from watching these scenes that they weren't aware of that's something that came up next season, because they are sitting across from each other. You tell Hector hates Gus, but I think the thought of that, just from I could be wrong, but it seems to me the thought of that in this episode was just that he doesn't like the fact that Gus is telling them what to do and preventing the cousins from killing Tuco. I think the intense hatred these two characters have for each other was something that they came up with in season 4, but that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing here to directly contradict it. It goes along with it. I just get the sense that they hadn't thought up of it yet. And then, of course, it's also interesting after seeing Better Call Saul and knowing of how deep they explored this backstory even more. But yeah, that was pretty interesting. So anyway, let's go ahead and move over to the next episode, which is Green Light. So, yeah, so this episode's okay. I guess this is the one. It's kind of funny, the scenes where Walt starts to go a bit crazy over the fact that Skylar cheated on him. And yeah, so you get some interesting character stuff with that. I like this scene with when Mike like recorded their phone conversations, playing it back to Saul, and Saul's like, "Is this a good big thing or a bad thing?" And then Walt says something crazy like, "Oh, blah, blah, I won't let you do this," and Saul's like, "This is a bad thing." And then Saul, and then of course, it's a very funny scene where Walt shows up at Ted's work and like bangs on his window, and Ted refuses to come out, and he's like, "Ted, I know you're in," and he tries starting to plant to crash through the window, but it just bounces off, and then security drives him away. It was kind of in the way like Ted's just hiding from him. That is kind of a funny scene. So, I mean, but there's nothing. Most of this episode is just again sort of just set up and putting things in motion. And then we get this other plot about Jesse trying to sell his own blue meth, which I don't know. Like, I didn't really like the storyline where I don't know if it was this episode or the next. Some of these episodes blend together, but where Walt ends up being a total dickhead to Jesse when Jesse tries to politely, "Hey, check out almost like the mentor saying to his mentor, like, check out this meth, look, I'm doing right by you," and Walt's like, "Oh, this is your imperfection here, blah, blah," and he gets all pissy and becomes a huge asshole. He's like, "You're not going to sell my product." I'm not saying that that's like completely out of character for him. There's an aspect of his character that definitely fits him, but it's not one I find particularly interesting or good storytelling or good television, to be honest. I kind of dislike that aspect of him, and I would rather that they not explore that more. And I think this scene, like this whole storyline here, kind of just muddles what's Walt's connection with Jesse, which is explored a whole lot more towards the end of the season. I mean, one could say that, that Walt is like denying his feelings for Jesse, and this shows how arrogant he is, and of course how prideful he is, and what brings him back to cooking eventually. And that is one of the main issues I have with these first 4 episodes, or 5 episodes, I believe it spills over to the next episode too, is that it's all about Walt refusing to cook and them trying to get Walt back, and Gus is trying to sort of trick Walt into cooking, which is something I'll touch on a bit later, how that's very important to him. And I didn't find that interesting, and it dragged on for a bit, and it's part of the reason why I found the first part of season 3 a bit of a slug to get through. But yeah. So this episode was decent. So we'll get into the next episode, which is Moss. So God, this episode kind of blends together. Oh yeah, this explores more the feud between Jesse and Walt, and his whole thing where Gus does buy the blue meth from Jesse, but only to piss Walt off and to try to antagonize him into getting him to actually work for him, as he gives half the money to Jesse and half the money to Walt, and the two of them like sort of argue, are very pissy with each other over this. Yeah, and I can't, again, I get my episodes blended. I can't remember if it's this one or the next one where Walt actually does agree to go back, and this is where Gus introduced Walt to this huge lab that's underground, saying, "Oh, I will give you all these things and all this stuff to work for," and so he does. I think it's this episode, and so he does go to work for Gus and tells Jesse that he's out and he's never going to make meth again. See, this is what I think is kind of undermines the ending of the season, that because Walt is being a colossal asshole to Jesse here, and is clearly showing, like, you could say, oh, it's because he cares about him, he doesn't want him involved in the drug trade anymore, which that's not the impression I get. I think that's a stretch to say that. So I think it kind of undermines just what a father figure he sees himself as to Jesse. And I know they've always had a rough relationship here and there, and he was the dickhead to him occasionally. I'm not even getting into the whole Jane thing, but I think this is going a bit too far. You might say, oh, more far than letting his girlfriend die? Yeah, but I think that's different because that's in secret. That's like a burden that he carries. That I actually do believe he was doing for Jesse's good, because he thought ultimately, because he was worried that he would die a drug addict and smoke all the money and die of an overdose. And so he literally was trying to save his life, but doing it in a very fucked up, backhanded way, but ultimately I think his intentions were good, and ultimately I think that the fact he hid that from Jesse, it was different than here, where he outright tells Jesse to his face, you suck, I hate you, fuck you, and like totally pisses Jesse off so much where he goes out and throws shit at Walt's windshield. And again, you could make the same argument that he's doing it for Jesse's good, but I think that argument is more flimsy in this case. Personally, that's just me. I didn't really care that much for this. It was interesting seeing the setup to the whole Gus winning Walt back. So let me get into the next episode, which is Sunset. So let me begin by I want to do the whole Gus thing, because this is where they first introduced Gale, and because Walt starts working at Gus's lab, and you see the huge lab underground he has. Now, this is very, very interesting from after watching Better Call Saul. In fact, there's still, at the time of this recording, there's still one season left of Better Call Saul to go, which they will probably set up even more what leads into this. But and then of course this all gets into Gus's sort of plan to strike back against the cartel, which you see the start of come to fruition in this season, which actually surprised me from recollection. I thought it was touched mainly on season 4, but they actually first mentioned it, they further it in season 4, mainly by having the cartel strike back. But there was first mentioned, Gus' ultimate plan was first mentioned in this season, and then Better Call Saul, particularly the later seasons of Better Call Saul, really are getting into the bare bones, building up to exactly how Gus is preparing for it and what he's doing and the kind of manipulation that he's playing. That's very interesting, I find. And of course, I'll cover Better Call Saul again, and I'll get into that more. But it's very impressive how neatly that fits. That prequel fits into a setup for this, where it feels like a natural setup, like that even enhances the storyline and makes it stronger, rather than being a very contrived, oh look, we're building the Death Star type setup with the prequels. Don't get me to that shit. So I mean, that's why Better Call Saul, a lot of people call it like the best prequel out there, or one of them. That doesn't even feel like a prequel, but it does. So it gives me a whole new perspective, having seen that, especially more recently than I've seen than the last time I watched Breaking Bad. Because we actually, in Better Call Saul, we see Gale. We see that Gale designed the lab. We see that Mike and Gus had to go through all this trouble to create the lab, which by the end of season 5, Better Call Saul is still not created left, and they had to hire this team of construction German engineers, and that goes wrong, so they had to fire them. They had to get more engineers, and they had to do it hide it from the cartel, which is an issue. So it's interesting, but I guess one could see it as kind of a retcon, because I'm sure some people, when they first saw this season, this episode, they're like, it's a bit unrealistic to have a huge high-tech chemistry lab just magically be underground underneath the laundry line. Like, how did he come up with that? How did he build it there? How did he hide it? How did he get all this equipment in without the cartel knowing it? But then, Better Call Saul pulled a Rogue One and sort of show, well, this is how. And then it all makes sense now. So it's kind of building up a sort of justifying the plot convenience or whatever. But I like it. I think ultimately it works. And it does give me sort of a better perspective on why Walt is so important to Gus this season. Why he was going through all this trouble to try to get Walt to work for him. And it went beyond, and this is something I don't think I've really truly realized even after they revealed his plot in this season until watching Better Call Saul. Didn't truly realize just how important Walt was to Gus's plans from freedom of the cartel, which they'll get into the backstory of that next season. But Better Call Saul, they get into that even more, how he's trying to form his own empire separate from the cartel, but of course cutting ties with them and taking over their territory is not an easy thing to accomplish. So he has to build up all of this infrastructure and all these plans in order to do that. And part of the plan, of course, is being able to sell drugs without having to transport them from Mexico, from manufacturing them right there in the United States. And Better Call Saul explored how he had to fight to get this done, that the cartel was totally against it. There was a no-no, but he did his trickery or whatever and his scheming in order to get himself to be in that position, and which is setting up for here, where here he needs Walt in order to sell it. Now, he already had a Gale, and there's something Better Call Saul establishes that his original plans was to use Gale, because at this point in time he never heard of Walt, and Walt wasn't a thing, Heisenberg or whatever. So he was simply going to use Gale to manufacture his own drugs. But I feel like he felt that was a sort of a weak part of the plan, and Gale was basically the best he had, but wasn't exactly satisfactory with Walt. They pretty much described him as a master. Like, he's like the best of the best of cooking meth, and so he's a much, much better alternative than simply using Gale. So that makes sense to me why Gus was so gung-ho and so concerned and so dead set on getting Walt, because his entire plan to separate from the cartel, to take over their territory, hinged on having Walt. Now, granted, he could pull it off with Gale, but it was not as strong. And when dealing with something so fragile as trying to separate from the cartel, which is a very dangerous proposition, it's better to have a more firm plan, and it's definitely more firm to have Walt there. So all that I found very interesting. So we get, but this episode in particular, I felt like I went off on a huge tangent here. But the episode Sunset in particular deals with Jesse trying, of course, being pissed off about being cut off, and he's trying to establish his own drug empire. He's trying to cook again, so he wants the RV. But as we saw in the previous episode, with a nice little flashback to show the origin of the RV, which I do think is a little bit of retcon, but it works for the show, so it doesn't bother me. But as we learn there, Hank is tracking the RV because he's become completely obsessed with Heisenberg and finding Heisenberg, which is an aspect I like. So Hank has Jesse sort of as scoped out, and Walt finds out about this. It's funny because Hank calls Walt and asks him because he knows Jesse from selling weed, that story that they came up with. And so it's funny, Hank inadvertently gives it away to Walt, but Walt feels he doesn't want to call Jesse directly because he's worried that Hank was tapping his phone. Now, I don't know for certain, but I'm pretty sure he wasn't. So, in retrospect, that was actually a bad decision by Walt, that he let his paranoia get the better of him. He was being too paranoid, that it would have been better off had he simply called Jesse and told him, because he didn't. Instead, he went behind his back and went directly to the RV, and that calls Jesse didn't know why Walt was doing it and just assumed that Walt was just being an asshole and trying to take away his business from him. So he came to the RV and led Hank directly there, which led to a very intense scene where Hank has sort of got Walt and Jesse trapped in the RV. Of course, he doesn't know Walt's there, and Walt has to keep his really has to keep his part in it secret. So he gets Jesse to come out, and they have that guy who owns the junkyard. For some reason in my mind, I thought this guy didn't appear until season 5, but here he is in season 3. So I guess I don't know, I just remember that wrong. But the cool guy, how he talks about, oh, this is a domicile, whatever, and they try all this legal trickery, which does make me think, like, in real life, like, police probably wouldn't have a conversation like that. They would just shoot the door down and deal with the consequences later. Judging from all the police violence that happens in the news, that seems like it would be a bit more realistic. But whatever, they try to sort of trick Hank, and he's like, all right, fine, I'll just get a warrant. So he sits there and waits for a warrant, and then Walt comes up with a plan to get Saul to use his assistant to pretend to be at a hospital, saying that Marie's been injured in a car crash and their life is in danger. So Hank goes away and he's freaked out, and it's interesting because his first feeling, learning that Marie's okay, is relief, but then he that relief turns into rage when he realizes that he was played, that someone specifically used his wife against him, or the threat of her being in danger, in order to get him to go away, and they managed to destroy the RV. So that was a hugely intense scene. So I did really like this episode. I did really appreciate that. One more thing about this episode: Sunset, it gets the title from when the Tuco's cousins, are just hanging out at Los Pollos Hermanos, trying to intimidate Gus into letting them kill Walt, and they keep saying how they're not going to wait any longer. So Gus kind of realizes that he needs to do something, because Walt is the linchpin in this whole plan, so he can't allow these guys to kill him. So he comes up with this other plan. I don't know if this is the plan all along, because they do sort of build into this where he says, you know what, you can't kill Walt. I'm not changing my mind, but you know what, you can kill Hank. And they were like, what? Our boss, the cartels, tells the DA he's off limits. He's like, well, I'm telling you, he's not off limits. You can go ahead and kill him. and so they switch course to going to kill Hank, which is what the cliffhanger of this episode was, which is a very effective cliffhanger. So this was a really good episode. I did really appreciate this one. Alright, so then we get into the next episode, which is 1 Minute, a very classic episode, arguably one of the best episodes of the show. When I was thinking about this, I thought, well, is it fair to call this one of the best episodes of the show? Because most of what makes this episode awesome is just the end. Like, it's not that, I mean, it's good, but it's not that outstanding until the last 5 minutes. So is that fair to say it's still one of the best episodes? It's still a great episode. And ultimately the conclusion I come to is yes, absolutely. Because even though most of the bulk of the episode isn't amazing, it's not amazing until the end, it's all set up for that amazing ending. You don't have that amazing ending, and the ending's not as amazing as it is without that perfect setup. So yeah, I do think this is an amazing episode overall. Now, before I get into the ending, though, in this episode, Walt this is when he changes his mind and decides to be a dickhead to Gale for no good reason, and now he starts nitpicking Gale the way he was with Jesse earlier, and as a way to kick out Gale and add in Jesse. And of course, part of this is the sympathy he's feeling for Jesse after seeing the struggle he's going through. And of course, at the start of the episode, Hank beats the fuck out of Jesse. I mean, the absolute fuck out of Jesse. Which is what the bulk of the episode is about. Hank dealing with the consequences of that, and Jesse is like, I'm gonna fucking kill Hank, I'm gonna destroy his life, I'll be like, that whole speech Jesse gave about how he's gonna be haunting Hank for the rest of his life. Like, I kind of thought, like, you're not fooling anyone, Jesse. You're not a badass. So I wasn't too impressed with that speech, but I guess that's how it was supposed to play out. It was mainly supposed to illustrate to Walt the issue. And of course, part of it is that he also wanted to do it for Hank, because if Jesse was there destroying his life, and then things wouldn't progress for him, and also, he got Jesse to drop the charges, which was very helpful to Hank as well. So that's also part of the reason why, Walt is like changed his mind and had Jesse, offered him full partnership. Now again, like, I get that, and I get he does have these fatherly feelings towards Jesse, but as I said, I think the previous storyline with him being like, oh, this meth sucks, you can't cook my product, undermines this, and that this would have been more smooth had they not had that. Because it's there, it's a bit harder to buy, and it does seem a bit abrupt, especially the way he's a total dickhead to Gale, and like, oh, you were never good in the first place, and Gale's like this huge, like, intellectual, like, guy, and then Jesse shows up, it's like, damn, bitch, this is dope, and acting like a moron, and Gale's like, oh, this is who you're replacing me with. And it did seem a bit too silly, and a bit too hard to buy. But okay, so let's stop beating around the bush here and get into the what really makes this episode great is the final scene with the showdown between Hank and Tuco's cousins. And again, as I said, the payoff for Tuco's cousins was great. This was one of the best moments of the entire show, but I still think that didn't require all that fucking setup. Didn't require them to act like Terminators in order to pull this. This would have worked regardless. They should trust in the strength of the scene. The scene speaks for itself. It's very powerful. You do need some setup. I mean, the Tuco's cousins can't appear out of nowhere, but you definitely don't need as much setup as we had. But anyway, because this is a powerful scene, and it speaks for itself. It's absolutely amazing. And again, this gets into Gus's whole sort of manipulation, because we saw in the previous episode that he said, oh, you can have Hank, you can kill Hank. And so when I first saw that, I thought, wow, Gus actually wants Hank dead, or at least is going to use Hank as a distraction so that they can kill him instead of killing Walt. But what's even better than that, though, and I didn't even think of this, is if Hank kills the cousins too. Because the cousins are a huge issue. Even if they did kill Hank off, they would still be an issue and a concern for Gus. And so the easiest thing to do is to get Hank to eliminate them, and so he, gives them that call, which is such an ominous, such an eerie scene. It's just so damn effective, the way he calls and says 2 people are coming to kill you. You have 1 minute, and Hank's like, "Oh, you just stop joking around with me, go me," or whatever. But then he starts to realize that it's not a joke. That was such a fucking intense scene. It was so damn powerful. But of course, Gus wasn't counting on Hank being suspended and not having his gun on him. So I do believe Hank was meant to kill them easily, but of course that didn't happen because he wasn't armed. And so it was a lot harder, and Hank nearly died. And then they had to set up with the arms dealer earlier in the episode that established that the cousins had the vests on, but it also showed, I thought it was a bit interesting the way the arms dealer is like, here's this cool bullet, and put it in the guy's pocket, and during the fight it fell out of his pocket, and Hank was able to load it into the gun and kill him with it. So, goddamn. I mean, that was just one of the most intense, suspenseful, just edge of your seat scenes I've ever seen ever. It was just, can't understate just how damn good it was. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is ICU. It's funny, this is about a hospital, ICU. I'm thinking of BoJack Horseman. But anyway, intensive care unit. Anyway, this is a good follow-up to it. This is also a very intense episode where Walt is sitting with the family, and they're, Marie's freaking the fuck out. She's like yells at Hank's boss and Gomi for taking his gun away, and these are all really powerful scenes. But of course, the stuff with Gus was absolutely amazing. How Gus sort of, Walt's lying to him because he's supposed to be cooking, and Jesse's just sitting there banging on drums because Walt didn't have a chance to show Jesse yet how to use the equipment, and Walt refuses to go there because he's, wants to be with Hank and Hank, his family, and so he lies to Gus, but then Gus shows right up in his hotel room and was like, "Oh, hi, Walt," and pretending not to know him. Like, that's pretty damn intense. And then Walt is obviously like freaked out about this, and he's like, why is this happening? It's happening because of me. Did you do this to get back at me? And Gus is like, "Oh, I hide in plain sight just like you." Like, really, really great scenes. I really appreciate that. I believe it was the next episode where Walt actually puts this all together. But basically, I'll talk about it now anyway, even though Walt spells it out in the next episode, that Gus wanted independence from the cartel, and he wants to have a manufacturer on this side that the cartel didn't control. Also, by having the cartel members attack DEA, that increases tension between the cartel and law enforcement, and so it makes it harder for the cartel to get back into the United States, and it keeps them at bay, keeps them away. And of course, you had the Juan Bolsa guy who's kind of caught on to this fact and is threatening to go after Gus, but then you see the federales show up at his house and kill him, which I thought he was still alive in season 4. Do they retcon? I can't remember if they retconned it to say he's still alive, but this whole time I saw Juan Bolsa in Better Call Saul. I could have sworn he was in season 4 of Breaking Bad, but maybe I'm wrong. But if they do retcon it somehow, I think that would be dumb, because they show him getting shot at point blank. He's wearing a bulletproof vest. I wouldn't buy that. But anyway, I don't know. I can't remember. I'll find out when I watch season 4, or someone's going to make a comment before I watch season 4. But anyway, that was awesome, especially the way that, after Juan got shot and killed, like, the way that Gus is instantly crack his phone open, like, so badass. It really does show the caliber of villain that Gus is. I think, like, the season 3 is really, really what established Gus as one of the best villains in television history. And he's just such a badass. So it does show that he didn't really care about helping Walt or anything. He had this really complex plan, as we see from Better Call Saul, that he started planning on for a really long time, for years, building up to trying to break independence from the cartels. And in season 4, when we get more of his backstory, we learn why he has so much animosity towards the cartel. So it's amazing storytelling. It's just amazing. So, we'll get into the next episode, which is Kafkaesque. If I remember correctly, I think when I did my top 5 worst episodes of Breaking Bad, this is number 5. I disagree with that. I totally changed my mind. I don't think this deserves to be in the top 5 worst. I can think of other episodes that I've even seen so far in these first 3 seasons that would deserve to be there more than this one. That being said, it's not that good of an episode. It is just like a setup, a transition episode that sort of moves the pieces around. It has Walt and Jesse starting to work in the lab again, and Jesse gets greedy and starts to, because he knows there's like all this, the meth that there's over, more than what they're supposed to cook, more they're getting paid for. And he's like, whoa, we're just giving this away for free. But Walt, of course, doesn't care. But Jesse sees an opportunity to start the side hustle, which is a storyline that doesn't really go anywhere. I mean, you could say it sets up some other things, but nothing really comes of it. So I kind of didn't like it and thought it was kind of a waste of time. And I think this is when no, that's not this episode, it's a later episode. But oh yeah, this is when Skylar gets Walt to pay for Hank's physical therapy, and she comes with the lie of the betting thing. And I think this is the episode. It might be this episode or the episode at 2 episodes from now. I can't remember. One or the other is the one where she meets Saul, which I had no idea. I watched the scene, and it showed Skylar in Saul's office, and it's looking at the diploma that said University of American Samoa law degree, which I had no idea that this was actually in Breaking Bad. I thought this was a totally made up thing for Better Call Saul. It's funny how they take just a prop and little things and create a whole backstory for Better Call Saul. It's such an amazing show. But there's a continuity error, though. There is an inconsistent, because on the diploma it says Saul Goodman, not Jimmy McGill, which is inconsistent with Better Call Saul, because he didn't actually change his name to Saul Goodman until much, much later. So his degree should have Jimmy McGill on it, unless he went and changed the diploma and got it a new one or whatever, and got the name changed to Saul Goodman when he changed his name. But I mean, I guess you could justify it that way, but it seems like a stretch to me. Regardless, the whole thing about Kafkaesque, because when Jesse's in his rehab and in his meetings, he's talking about how he hates his job and it sucks and everyone hates him, and he doesn't mention the fact that he's making drugs or that he's a millionaire, which is kind of really important nuggets of information. But he's talking about how creepy everyone is, and so the guy is like, oh, that's very Kafkaesque, and Jesse latches onto that. It's like, yeah, man, it's totally Kafkaesque. And later when he's talking to what's his face, Badger and Skinny Pete, he's like, it's totally Kafkaesque, and they also try to put, oh yeah, act like they know what he's talking about. But anyway, I think it's this episode that introduced Skinny and Badger going to the rehab to try to sell meth, which I didn't like that storyline either. So yeah, this episode, I don't think this is one of the worst of the show, but it's definitely not that good. It's definitely just average at best. But speaking of one of the worst of the entire show, alright, let's get into this next episode, and we're going to have to do it. Episode 10 of Season 3, Fly. Now, this is probably the most controversial episode of the show. It is the most contested, it's the most inconsistent. When I first saw this episode, I wasn't aware of what other people thought of it. I just knew what I thought of it. And what I thought immediately, this episode is terrible. It is very clearly the worst episode of the show. Now, and it's funny because when my sister first started watching the show, I told her that there's an episode in Season 3 that is the clear worst episode of the show, but I didn't tell her which one it was. And she came back to me immediately after she watched this episode, and I was like, oh, it's this. I knew which episode you were talking about, the first 2 minutes in. I knew this was going to be the worst episode. And you are absolutely right. This is totally the worst episode of the entire show. Now, it wasn't until a year or so later where I became aware of the fact that there was a large group of the fan base that considered this the singular best episode of the show. Mind you, there's some people who may not consider it the best episode of the show, but do really like it and think it's one of the better episodes. But there's a large group of people that think this is the best episode of the show. I met someone at my work, I think last year, and started talking about Breaking Bad, and he said to me, "It's like, oh, do you want to know what my favorite episode of Breaking Bad is?" And I'm like, "Don't say it, don't say it, don't say it." He's like, "The one with the fly." I'm like, "No, you said it. God damn it!" I just don't get why people like this episode. Now, I think I'm going to make an entire video about this episode, like do an entire essay on it, which I really could. That because I've watched some video essays that trying to explain why they believe that this episode is one of the best of the show, that it has a bad rap, why it's completely necessary, and why it's very powerful character storytelling, and it has very powerful metaphoric storytelling. And to be fair, like the one video I watched, the guy was being very, very like trying to be fair to the critics of this episode and trying to be very polite and non-confrontational. So I feel kind of like a dick for being a dick and being like, "You're wrong. This episode sucks." But so I might one day make a video where I have the same kind of tone, but sort of explain my perspective on how I feel. I actually very strongly disagree. A lot of things said in that video and other videos and other things I've heard people say over the years why they love this episode, I just personally disagree with. Like, I don't think that's the case. Like, I've heard someone make the argument that this was not filler, that is totally necessary because you need... it explains why Walt, his fatherly feelings towards Jesse, which is very important towards the end of the season, where Walt like risks his life to stand up for Jesse, and without this episode, that ending wouldn't work. Which I think is, I really disagree with that. I think it's factually incorrect. I literally don't think you need this episode for that. I think it's already been established. Granted, the whole shit about, oh, this meth sucks, that kind of muddied the waters a bit. But it had been established all the way back in Season 2, especially that finale of Season 2, the scene with Walt and Q, which this episode calls back to, firmly established how Walt looks at Jesse as a son, as he sees him, as he feels like he's a father figure, like he's another son to him. So you don't need this episode. You most certainly don't need this episode from that. It's already been established. I would argue that it's nice to have that reminder of it, but I would make the strong argument that you could have that reminder in a different context, in a different episode. You do not need an entire episode about Walt trying to kill a fucking fly in his lab in order to accomplish this. And in fact, I think it really damages that story rather than helps it. So, alright, let me get into the crux of this. Why I hate this episode so much. Because first of all, it's completely out of character for Walt. I don't buy it. I mean, granted, he has been shown to be a bit obsessive and egotistical and off the wall sometimes, but this takes it to an extreme that I completely don't buy. Now, again, the video that loved this episode was trying to defend that, saying, well, he's kind of in extreme circumstances here because of what happened with Hank, and his life has become a bit dull and routine, and so it's causing him to crack. I'm sorry. I don't buy it. I really don't think it's good storytelling. I think it is bad character story, and I think it's contrived. I think it is extremely contrived because this is the kind of writing I really don't like. The kind that sort of stretches the way a character would behave, or stretches the way situations would behave, especially characters. I mean, both characters, Walt and Jesse, not just Walt, in order to tell this comedic story that they want to tell. And it felt that way. It felt really like they're having to try so hard to fit a square peg into a round hole. That's what this episode felt like to me. And it's cheap comedy, I think. You know, a lot of people that I did find that I met in person who really liked this episode seemed to be like they liked more comedic stuff. And I talked about how Breaking Bad has always had this dark comedy element to it, which is often overlooked because the dramatic and action and suspense elements are so strong and overpowering that it's often like overlooked that it has this comedic element, which I have stated and will continue to state actually works for the show and works to enhance the show except for this episode, because they take that comedic element too far. It actively interferes with the drama. It actively interferes with the character stories that they're trying to tell. Because Walt wouldn't be so obsessed and call it containment. Like, the way things he says in this episode, like, they get giggles from me, I'll be honest. They are kind of humorous to ways. There's a containment, but it's completely out of character. He would not fucking act this way, I'm sorry. And it seems like they're contriving the writing that way. Now, as for a couple of reviews and videos I watched that said that The Fly is a metaphor. That it's not really about the fly, it's a metaphor. And like I've heard, it was a metaphor for Walt's guilt over having killed Jane and all that, and he has to move past this guilt in order to move on. Kind of like they have to move past the fly in order to start cooking. And as soon as I hear anything like that, anyone mentioning anything like that, my honest guttural reaction to that is to groan. I'm sorry. That is so pretentious if that's the case. Ooh, it's a metaphor. No. And this episode does come off as trying to be all artsy. Like, the comedy aspect of it, like Walt like smacking the fly and ended up smacking himself in the head, it reminds me of like these artsy Pixar shorts or animated shorts, which I do like, and I think they work because they're animated and they're meant to be comedic, and they are artsy in that form, but they're trying to input this into the Breaking Bad setting, and it does not fucking fit. It's a square peg in a round hole, and should be noted, this episode is directed by Rian Johnson. that he always has to have a divisive story that half the people love and half the people hate. And I think, well, if you can compare this to The Last Jedi, which of course came out later, although I'm not sure if he wrote this episode, he just directed it. But anyway, so I'm not sure how much creative control he had over it, because he also directed Ozymandias, which is clearly the best episode of the show, but I'll get to that later. But anyway, as for this episode, it seems like it's similar to The Last Jedi in terms of Rian Johnson has a particular artistic style that he wants to tell, but he's inputting it into an already established story and not taking into account what's already been established and only worried about what he's trying to tell. And to be clear, I liked The Last Jedi. I thought it was a great movie. I didn't think it was a good Star Wars movie, especially was not good as the second part of a trilogy. Like, it would have kind of worked. You change situations around, change names and characters and stuff. It would work as a standalone Star Wars movie like Solo or whatever, and it would be much better than Solo. But it didn't seem to acknowledge that it was the sequel of another film and that it was setting up for another film. So it was a terrible, even though it was a good standalone movie, it was a terrible, like, second part in the three-parter. And so with The Fly, well, I don't think it's a good episode, period. I mean, but if you take it outside of the Breaking Bad context and just have it as a comedy episode, okay, fine, I can see it. It would be decent. It could be good in that regard. But in the Breaking Bad context, it's just stupid. It's mind-numbingly stupid, and I really do think you absolutely can skip this episode without missing a beat. In fact, anyone watching this show, if I gave any recommendations, I would say skip over season 3, episode 10. You do not need to watch it. It's a waste of your time. It will just upset you, and you'll have to sit through the garbage. You don't need it. You absolutely get the flow of the story without it. Absolutely you do. Because you already been established Walt's fatherly feelings towards Jesse. You're not missing anything from skipping this episode. Nothing. Except for crap, basically. Except for contrived, pretentious storytelling. That's all you're missing. I'm sorry. But I do really have it in for this episode. Now, if I'm going to be fair, I will admit I did like the scene with Walt reminiscing with Jesse about Jane and how Walt has been drugged, like Jesse drugged him to try to get him to sleep. and he's talking about how the guilt he felt, and also I like how he felt like the perfect moment for him to die would have been that moment where that night where Jane died, like before he went out and killed her. And of course he doesn't say it outright because he doesn't want to admit to Jesse, although you get the feeling that he almost admitted to Jesse that he was responsible for killing Jane here. That was a cool scene. So I will admit that was a great character scene. It did help develop the moment, and so I'll disagree with some people who hate this episode who said that scene was just recapping what we already know. I actually disagree with that. I think that was a good character development and a nice step in Jesse and Walt's story. But here's the thing. Does it justify this episode just because that one scene was good? Does that mean this is one of the best episodes that exist? No, absolutely not. And does it justify this episode's existence? Does it make it any less stupid that this whole episode is about Walt being obsessed with killing a singular fly in his lab to the point of like kicking Jesse's ass and knocking him out of the lab and refusing to cook anymore? Does it justify any of that? Absolutely, positively not. No, just because that one scene is good does not mean this episode isn't a piece of shit. It's still a piece of shit. They just should have put that scene in a different and better episode. And I'll tell you what, and this is what I talked about towards the start of the video about how the pacing of the season was a bit off. Because this episode should not exist. Instead, you should have an episode or maybe the next episode should be where this episode is, and you should have another episode in between that and the final two that explore Andrea more. Because I did feel the pacing was off with Andrea's storyline, that we didn't get, like, it was like, boom, she's introduced, and boom, Jesse's in love with her, and boom, Jesse's willing to kill someone over her or her kid or whatever. And I felt like we needed more, like, they rushed that, and I will talk about that. As much as I absolutely, and I will not understate this, absolutely love the final two episodes of the season, I do feel they were a little bit rushed, and that they wasted time with this bullshit instead of actually setting up for it properly. So here's what I would have done. I would have 86 the whole Fly storyline gone. Instead, you have other storyline that revolves around Jesse getting to know Andrea and getting known better, and you intercut that with some scenes with Jesse and Walt in the lab, and Walt is just letting the stress get to him, and so he has that tender moment where he confesses the thing about this is when he should have died. You keep that. You can have that without having the fucking Fly part. and then you just set up Gus and what he's doing more. You set up Mike a bit more, and you definitely establish Andrea and her family more, and that would have been a much better season and a much better ending of the season than just having this pretentious waste of time. But that's just me. Anyway, yeah, so yeah, I spent a lot of time talking about this episode, but as I say, I could go longer talking about this episode. It's just, I don't know. I gotta respect people's opinions. I feel like, I suppose, if they love this episode, but what angers me is when they kind of try to insult people who don't like the episode and be like, oh, they're just looking at it superficially. It's just because there's no action. There always has to be action. Oh, there's no action. There's not enough action for you. That pisses me off, because my favorite episodes are the ones that are just two people in the room talking. My favorite episode of television, one of my favorite episodes of television of all time, is the episode Duet from Deep Space Nine, which is two people in a room talking. In fact, I prefer just dialogue-heavy episodes with two people in the room talking than I do two action-heavy or suspense episodes. So I hate that straw man. It pisses me off. And they specifically say, oh, just because it's a bottle episode, you think it sucks. No, Duet was a bottle episode. It's one of the best episodes ever created, ever. They're amazing bottle episodes. This is a shitty one. Anyway, sorry. And it was created because they were running out of money. But there's nothing wrong with that. They can do a bottle episode. Just do a better one. Do one that's not so fucking pretentious. Anyway, sorry, I keep saying we're going to move on, but I don't. So let's move on. Next episode is EBQ. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I'm sure I pronounced it wrong. I am sure of that one thing. But anyway, this episode was okay. This is the episode I mentioned that establishes Andrea, which is good. I just wish they should have spent more time establishing her and Jesse's connection to her, especially because they're coming off of Jane, and who is really well established, as I talked about in season 2. Really well established character. Love Kristen Ritter to death. They're going to introduce another love interest to Jesse. They should have taken more time to do so. Now, and especially if she becomes important for the rest of the series, although she never becomes to the level of Jane, but I still think they should have developed more her connection. I did like how Jesse instantly starts to connect to her once he finds out that she has a son, because that's very consistent with his character, that he has a thing with kids, that he we saw in the episode Peekaboo, that he has these fatherly instincts and wanting to protect children. In fact, he tells her off at one point for wanting drugs, when at first his whole point was to try to sell drugs to her. So I did like that. This storyline of Walt, Gus inviting him to dinner, to just, I don't know, that felt like a waste of time. He was trying to get Walt to sort of let Jesse go, which I think is inconsistent with how Gus treats Jesse in season 4, but I'll talk about that when I get to season 4. This was it was a pretty good episode. I think this is the episode when Jesse first learned that Combo was killed by, I think it's the cousin or brother-in-law or something of Andrea, and that these two, gangster guys are using 11-year-old kids to kill him. I think it was this episode when he first revealed that, which sets up for the finale nicely. So, decent episode. Certainly a lot better than the last one. Anyway. Alright, so now I'll get into the final 2 episodes of the season, Half Measures and Full Measures. And it's funny because I think when I did my top 10 video, I counted this as like 1-2-parter. And it's really not. I think it's the titles kind of fooled me into thinking it was, because the titles are so similar. But these episodes are really distinct, at least as much as any episode can be, especially back-to-back ones that exist in a serialized storytelling format such as this one. So, Half Measures deals more with Jesse finding out that, as I said, the revelation in the previous episode, that these drug dealers who killed Combo used a kid to do it, who was like the nephew, or I can't remember her relation, maybe younger brother to Andrea, the girl she's with, and she has a young boy herself, and that Jesse's become attached to, and him coming up with a plot to try to kill said drug dealers. And first he goes to Walter White for assistance, which he's not on board, which actually I think that was the previous episode too, if I remember correctly. And this episode he tries to execute the plan using Wendy, the prostitute that we'd seen in previous episodes, which was a very powerful whole sequence. But we get the whole thing with, Walt tries to come up with a plan to arrest Jesse, to stop him from doing anything stupid. And this is when we get the very infamous Half Measures speech, or should I just say famous, well-known, iconic Half Measures speech from Mike. And this is when I think the show really starts to develop Mike. Now, it already had bled in some scenes like it often does with minor characters. I don't think they ever intended to make Mike as big of a character as it became. They often throw in these scenes with minor characters, like they showed Mike with his granddaughter, which I love. We got the whole backstory with Better Call Saul. Although I don't think the age matches because it's definitely obviously a very different actress who plays the granddaughter, but she looks actually the same age or younger here, where she should actually be like, what, 5 or 4 years older? But anyway, getting sidetracked. This really developed Mike in his whole half-measure speech. Now, I do think that Mike has portrayed in season 3 is a bit more inconsistent with the rest of the show and Better Call Saul. Like, I think Better Call Saul stayed, their portrayal of Mike stayed more consistent with Mike's portrayal in season 4 and 5 of Breaking Bad, as I think he's shown as a bit too bloodthirsty here, especially, like, I mean, you can make the argument, oh, he's very non-wanting to kill and not bloodthirsty in Better Call Saul, and the whole show is about him making the progression to becoming a bit more, which is true, but and we still have one season left of Better Call Saul, so he could become even more bloodthirsty, but I think them making the leap to as bloodthirsty as he is here is just something I don't buy. And also, as I said, I think season 4 and 5 of Breaking Bad, he's not this bloodthirsty and he's more reasonable. So I think that's just an inconsistency with Breaking Bad itself, and Better Call Saul decided to stay truer to the portrayal of Mike in season 4 and 5, which is probably when the show and the writers had more of a handle on this character anyway, so it just makes his portrayal here in this season a bit more inconsistent with everything else, but that's fine. I mean, that's okay. It's just a minor thing, and I'm sure I'm going to have people disagree with me and say, no, it's very consistent, whatever, but this is just the way I see it. But that half-measure speech was quite fucking amazing. And how, he laid it out to Walt, like, no half measures. Because he's basically telling Walt to kill Jesse. Which, again, I think that's kind of inconsistent. But whatever. I don't know. I think I do, as much as I love these two episodes, I think they are maybe a bit, like Mike and Gus and everyone's a bit too gung-ho on killing Jesse and Walt. Well, Walt will be the next episode. We'll get to that. But anyway, so Gus tries to make peace between these two, drug dealer guys and Jesse. And then Jesse brings up, oh, they're using children. So Gus is like, no kids. Which, in retrospect, maybe he should have been a bit more specific. Because the drug dealers respond to this by killing Tomas. And, of course, that makes Jesse want to kill these drug dealers. Now, I do wonder if, and again, that whole aspect felt a bit maybe unrealistic, because if Gus, who's a scary dude, who's a very scary dude, and their boss, tells them, no kids, is it really the smart thing to actually just kill the kid that's working for him? Do you think that's what Gus was talking about? I think clearly it's not what he was talking about. And I think that even if they don't think Gus is going to kill him over that, they would not want to antagonize a scary dude like Gus. So I kind of think that was a little bit of plot convenience that they just decided to go ahead and kill Tomas. But it works for a really great plot. And this is an amazing character story for Jesse. And I think it's very consistent with how he's been portrayed, how he cares about children. And and he's actually a good guy. Like, he can't tolerate what these drug dealers are doing. And he just goes over the edge. And I think that's very consistent. And I think this show is very clear in portraying him that he's not a killer, which this episode, and especially the next episode, hammer home that he definitely is not a killer. But so I think it's very consistent, his portrayal here, because he's still not being a cold-blooded killer. He's just pushed over the edge when they kill Tomas, so he goes to kill them. And Walt sort of, I love how Walt finds out on the news about this, that Jesse himself didn't tell him, because at this point Jesse still feels a bit betrayed by Walt. But I mean, God, that scene at the end where Jesse is about to throw down with the two drug dealers, and Walt comes out of nowhere, runs them over, and shoots one of them in the head fuck, that is an intense scene. It definitely still remains, in retrospect, one of the most intense scenes of the entire show. One of the best scenes of the entire show. That scene is amazing. So I guess this episode is a little similar to 3 minutes in the regards that the ending sequence really makes the episode. But I think this episode, even more so than 3 minutes, the bulk of the episode supports it better, and it was pretty much an amazing episode throughout its entire run, because the build up they had to like the trying to make peace with Gus, and the whole half measure speech, and the dilemma that Jesse had, the dilemma that Walt had, like this is all amazing character stuff that just accumulated in this absolutely mind-blowing ending, which is so shocking. It was the most effective, shocking sequence. And it was like the last thing I was fucking expecting the Walt to just show up out of nowhere, run them over, and shoot one of them in the head. Like, god fucking damn, that was amazing. It was just great storytelling. I have not much else to say about that. So anyway, getting to the next episode, which is Full Measures, which is actually a very different episode. It proceeds after this one. So it's, well, it comes after it. I don't know if proceeds is the right word, but whatever. It comes after. But it's a very different episode because it's now Walt is the one who's in deep shit. And it's a pretty intense episode from the beginning. I like the opening scene. How Walt tries to meet with Gus to make peace, and he's like in the middle of the desert and far away, and Mike calls him, and Walt's like, before I get out of the car, I need some assurances, and Mike's like, well, I assure you that I can kill you from over here. Again, like doing such a good job with Mike, and then so then Walt kind of is like, I actually agree with Walt here, where he's like, you could kill me, and you could hunt Jesse down and kill him, but that seems kind of a waste. Which I actually kind of agree with him, and I think later Gus being so obsessed with killing Jesse and Walt maybe doesn't make a little bit of sense, but I know I get a lot of pushback on that. People say, oh, it's totally in Gus's character because you can't cross him and live, which I definitely see that. I definitely understand that it's not because Gus said that Walt and Jesse should have just let him take care of those dudes, which I'm sure he would have. But Jesse, of course, was too enraged to see things that way, and Walt, of course, was doing it just to save Jesse. Now, Walt implies that Jesse thinks that maybe Gus was responsible for having those guys kill Tomas, and I think that's totally incorrect. Maybe Jesse actually thought that way, but if he did, he'd be totally incorrect in letting his rage get the better of him, because it's clearly not the case. Clearly, Gus is a businessman who wants things to run smoothly, so by having them kill an 11-year-old that's not how you make things run smoothly. Especially since he knows that would just cause more issues with Jesse. I don't think Gus would purposely want to antagonize Jesse, as is noted with him trying to make peace. So I think there is an argument to be made that they should have just let Gus handle it, but of course I completely understand, think it's totally within their characters that they're too blinded by rage to do so, and that they thought in the moment, and so Gus now sees them as unreliable because they killed 2 of his men. Now, does he really care about those men he killed? No, not really, but it's more of that it illustrates to him that Walt defied him, blatantly defied him, and is trying to get away with it, and that can't stand. So I understand that point, but the fact that he gets so gung-ho and he's so insistent on killing them both to the point where he's obsessed with, you must find Pinkman and kill him. Why? He's no longer, Walt is correct. He's no longer an issue to you. Gus is a businessman, and Jesse's no longer actively interfering with his business. Now, true, Jesse defied him and he needs to make an example of him, the gangster law and all that, but would he be that obsessed with doing it? I don't know. It just seems out of Gus's character a little bit to me. But again, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of pushback against that. People saying, no, it's totally within Gale. Well, fine. I just see things a bit differently. But anyway, so you might, don't misunderstand me here. I love this episode to death. I think this episode is, as I said, it's intense from the beginning. That established, that has that awesome scene, and then has Walt cooking with Gale, and it's very clear that Gus wants Gale to take over from Walt, and so he can kill Walt and move on. And that becomes clear to Walt. And I think it's really interesting that Gale is the only one who doesn't know. He thinks that he's going to keep working with Walt, and like Gus tries to lie to him, say, oh, it's because he has cancer or whatever. And he's like playing Gale, but it's very clear because Gale wouldn't be okay with him killing Walt, which makes Gale's death at the end of the episode even more tragic because he's a good person. He is being used by Gus, and so Walt and Jesse have to use him against Gus. So it's very tragic. Like, Gale is actually a decent person, although he is a libertarian. Sorry, not gonna get my political views put in here, but anyway. So, anyway, he's also vegan, they say later. I don't know, libertarians usually aren't vegan, but I don't know, there's exceptions to every rule. Anyway, sorry, getting very sidetracked. So, yeah, and so when they reveal, like, when they keep him, I love how they make the audience think that Jesse ran away, because Walt tells Gus that he was far away, and they plant something for Mike. Oh yeah, Saul gives Mike something that says Jesse ran away to Virginia, but it turns out that he was in Albuquerque all along. And I like how they fooled the audience on that one, not just, Mike and Gus. I think that was cool, and how Walt comes up with the plan to kill Gale in order to save their lives. And I like how Walt says point blank to Jesse, is like, look, I just saved your life. You need now to help me save my life, because my life is in danger now. Which is pretty powerful. And I think Jesse sees that. I think he's appreciative towards that. And ultimately, he does kind of look at Walter as a father figure as well. It's not just that Walter looks at Jesse as a son figure. I think there's a bit of fatherly love, a little bit in there. Of course, that becomes more distorted later in the show. But at this point, especially after what Walt just did for him, I think that's definitely the case. But again, as Jesse makes it very clear that he's not a killer. Like, he's not going to just kill someone in cold blood, especially someone who is a good person and doesn't deserve it. So Walt's like, that's fine, I'll do it, because Walt is becoming more of a cold-blooded killer now. But then it gets in the situation, this super intense, where they go to kill Walt, and I like how Walt recognizes it right away, and he pretends to panic. He pretends to be afraid. And like, oh, please don't kill me. I'll give you Jesse. And calls Jesse. He's like, do it. That was fucking intense, and I absolutely love that showdown. The look on Walt's face after he told Jesse to kill Gale. He's like, and he just says the address. Which I've lived in Albuquerque for a year, so I recognize the road. I was like, hey, I remember that road. It's not the road I lived on, but I didn't recognize it. But anyway, and he says the address to Mike, and with his, facade of being afraid, and oh, don't kill me, just instantly vanishes. He's like, yeah, that's right, bitch. I know his address, so you better not kill me, otherwise you got nobody to cook. Ha ha ha. And the look on Mike's face where he's just like enraged, like spitting rage. He's like, rah! Like, so amazingly great. And again, this, knowing the backstory from Better Call Saul and everything, knowing how Gus's entire plan, his entire war with the cartel, everything he's been planning and building and investing millions of dollars in for years, is all hinges on him having a cook. And so he now thinks that key piece of cook can't be Walter White because he's proven himself unreliable. I can't hinge my whole plan on this madman who's proven himself to be unreliable, so I need to switch to Gale. But now he's about to find that his entire plan, he can't use Gale because Gale's going to be killed. And so he's forced against his will to keep this man alive. Which is what a lot of season 4, not to give away spoilers, but come on, you should have seen the whole show by now if you're watching this video. So that's what all of season, at least the start of season 4 will be about. And that was just, goddamn, that was fucking intense. And then of course the scene where Jesse actually shows up to kill Gale is like amazing. It's heartbreaking beyond belief. Aaron Paul just gives a masterful performance. It's clearly he's not a killer. Clearly he doesn't want to kill, but Walt spelled it out to him. It's him or us. That's your choice. If you do not kill him, we will be dead. Plain and simple. Guy doesn't deserve to die. He means us no harm. But if you don't kill him, we are dead. Like, that's the dilemma. It is a very interesting dilemma. It's a very intense dilemma. I think it's great character building for Jesse and Walt. And it's just a fantastic way to end the season. Just mind-blowing. Maybe one of the best cliffhangers of all time. Even though, I don't know if you could really call this a cliffhanger. Even though they do cut to black when Jesse shoots the gun. You hear the gunshot. You see Jesse point the gun at Gale. You hear the gunshot. It's pretty conclusive that he killed Gale, and again, spoilers, which you shouldn't be spoiled, shouldn't care about them. He does. So it's not like the whole Negan killing the cameraman bullshit that they did in Walking Dead, which is a bullshit cliffhanger. This was actually a good one because it did make it very clear that Jesse did kill Gale, which it should have. Like, if it ended before, does he do it? And it shows like Victor almost reaching Jesse, and it makes it unclear whether or not he killed Gale, and they cut to black. That would be a bullshit cliffhanger. That would be the fucking Walking Dead Negan killing the cameraman bullshit cliffhanger. But this actually heavily implying that Jesse killed Gale was an amazing cliffhanger. Great. It's like Breaking Bad, like, the whole production around these 2 episodes was like top notch, best you can best. How many times do I say the word best? These episodes are amazing. Okay, so that is it. Those are all the episodes of season 3 of Breaking Bad. Now, as I normally do, I'll get into my least favorite and my favorite episode of this season. Now, as for my least favorite episode, there were some contenders for this one, such as Moss and Kafkaesque, which were both like kind of just boring, okay episodes, or No Moss, which, as I said, I really didn't care for. It was cheesy. It dealt with the aftermath of the airplane crash. But for worst episode of the season, come on. No contender. The clear winner here is Fly, which will spoil, I think is the worst episode of the show. I think it's the worst episode of the Breaking Bad universe, if you include Better Call Saul and everything else. Is way worse than anything Better Call Saul did. I think, in fact, I did a video where I named it one of the worst episodes from any show. I feel that passionate about that. This is a terrible episode because it's out of place. The comedy is silly slapstick, and the characters are completely out of character. It just tries to pretend to be pretentious and artsy, and so, ooh, look, it's a metaphor, but it's out of place. Like, there's good ways to do metaphors. There's awesome ways. It's not like, oh, I hate metaphor, I just want action, and the suspense, I just want to see Jesse and Walt shoot people. No, I love character-based. I love dialogue-based. That's why I love this show so much, because it's so character-based. It's got strong characters. I love 2 people sitting in the room talking and hashing it out. I love that shit. I love it. Fuck action. Fuck suspense. This great dialogue character stories I love. This is not it. This is the bad example. This is the goofy, oh, let's kill this fly. That's completely out of character. It makes no goddamn sense for anything. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible episode that everyone should skip. You absolutely do not need to watch this episode to like this show or to get what's going on. Anyway. Well, I shouldn't say fuck action because I do like action a bit, but I prefer dialogue character stuff when it's done correctly. Anyway, let me get into my favorite episode of the season, the best episode of the season. You got some runners up for this, like the ABQ, if that's how you pronounce it. I See You, good follow up to Hank getting shot. But as for the best episode, it boils down to 3 episodes: 1 minute, half measures, and full measures. I think I referred to this episode 3 minutes at one point. It's 1 minute, which makes more sense because that's what it says. But anyway, boils down to those 3 episodes, and I love them all. I think they're all great episodes, but when it comes down to this, I'm going to have to name Half Measures as the best episode of season 3. I just think the character story with Jesse, and his dilemma of wanting to kill these guys, and it really shows his strength of character on how he just cannot he cannot accept children being used and abused in this manner, and it just drives him over to the edge to the point where he wants to defy his own boss, who's a very dangerous fucking guy, in order to stop this from happening. And when they kill an 11-year-old kid, well, they can't fucking do that, and he just loses it. But Walt, who's the whole time has been trying to speak reason, trying to be like, no, Jesse, calm down, see reason. Instead of doing that, he helps Jesse. He comes out of nowhere, saves Jesse's life, runs over them with the car, and shoots him in the head. Fucking hell. An absolutely picture perfect, amazing ending. Love this episode to death. So, my rating for season 3 of Breaking Bad out of 10, I think I'm going to give this a 9. In the past I've given this an 8. I was almost leaning towards 8. But I think this earned 9-ness. Despite the fact that it is a bit dull in the beginning. Despite the fact that, I'm going to change my mind. It has Fly in it. I'm going to give it an 8. Now scratch that. 8, extremely good, is my rating because I forgot about Fly. The episode Fly brings it down from a 9 to an 8. I'm sorry. So it's an 8. Those last 2 episodes alone almost make it a 9 because it's so amazing. But, Fly counteracts that. Absolutely mind-blowing season. Yeah, as I said, the pacing's a bit off. And the beginning was a bit boring, but the character stories are strong throughout the entire season, except for that one episode. Throughout even the slower episodes, except for that one, the character stories remain constant, they remain strong. This is when they really crafted the show into a really great show, in my opinion. Anyway, that is it for my review of Breaking Bad Season 3. I will be back next month to review Season 4 of Breaking Bad, so keep an eye out for that. Also, check out my channel as I cover many other shows, like anything Star Trek, and I cover Discovery, The Outer Limits, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.